Masterclass 502 this is, so round 5, topic number 2. We have about 50 different topics going around, and if you're signed up for this round, the 7 masterclasses of this round, you will get links to the previous 7 as well. Obviously, I want you to stay around much longer, like most of you are actually doing, which is the 6-month subscription service. So consider it if you enjoy what you hear. Writing Act 2. Covering today, we will be entering hell. That is the plight of the screenwriter. We spend quite a bit of time there, whether you like it or not. The 3 acts, we go back to the 3 acts to then define where we will focus our attention today, Act 2. What don't you want? Very important question. I'll give you the solutions to the most common problems. We go back to hell again, I'm sorry, and we'll talk about breaking it up and finally the meat in between. So, writing is often spending lots of time in development hell. Now, development hell, that term is usually used when studios struggle to make a project work. Ultimately, it's the writer who needs to do it, who needs to deliver the goods. And if you look at the specific tasks of the writer, the greatest portion of that development hell will sit in making that second act work. And that's what we're focusing on today. When we speak about a second act, usually that is within the confines of the 3-act structure. In a minute, I'll show you what it means if we use a different paradigm, and what acts we're talking about in that case. It's slightly different. But first of all, why is the first act, and the third act as well, easier to write than that second act? Well, for the first act, we have a fairly strict and straight and clear path. We need to set up the character, we need to set up the world, something major will happen to that character, that's the inciting incident or the call to adventure, and then they develop, they formulate some sort of goal with the help or without the help of a mentor. And then at the end, or once that's all done, we consider Act 1 finished, completed. And then we go into Act 2 where we want to see the action, where we want to see the character act upon that desire to achieve the goal. Visually represented, you're all familiar with this timeline, in which we see the Act 2 taking significantly more screen time than Act 1 and 2. In fact, it's about the same as the Act 1 and 2 and 3 rather combined. So we'll be looking at this portion. Now, if we're working within the 4-act structure, it'll be like this. So then we'll be talking about Act 2 and 3 today. So that's the portion that's hardest to write. And yet, you can talk about the 5-act structure if you have a mid-act, that is some sort of an extended midpoint reversal. And then we'll be talking about Act 2, 3, and 4. No matter how you look at it, there's that big chunk of time, that big chunk of film that you need to write, and it's pretty daunting. And despite the fact that so many people use these timelines to represent story and to help writers understand their task, if you look at that chunk of text or film like this, there's not much about it. It's horrifying. So you need to make that blank line interesting. This is the visual equivalent of the blank page. And yes, sometimes it feels like hell. If you fail, then 3 things can happen for the audience and for the reader. The result could be boring. It could be dull. It could be tedious. This at the moment is Taylor Sheridan. He's the writer of Sicario, Hell or High Water, and Wind River. He learned the craft about screenwriting. He learned the craft of screenwriting when he was an actor. And when he's being asked how he did that and how he got to the point where he is today, which is quite successful, he's a steadily working screenwriter, he said, well, I just avoided all the bad things I came across in these bad screenplays. It's all the stuff that I don't want to see on the screen. I make sure I don't do that. And it reminds me of this one scene from his movie Hell or High Water, at least he wrote it, where two characters, including the Jeff Bridges character, go to the T-Bone Cafe to have something to eat. And then this happens.
Howdy, ma'am. How you doing today?
Hot, and I don't mean the good kind. So what don't you want?
Pardon?
What don't you want?
Oh, well, I think I'll just,
You know, I've been working here for 44 years. Ain't nobody ever ordered nothing but T-bone steak and a baked potato. Except this one asshole from New York tried to order trout back in 1987. We don't sell no goddamn trout. T-bone steaks. So either you don't want the corn on the cob, or you don't want the green beans. So what don't you want?
I don't want green beans.
I don't want green beans either.
I love this scene, and you can easily see the metaphor here for writing. What we all want is a good romp, interesting characters who are facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles and are going for it, who are fighting, struggling, and suffering to achieve their goal. So what don't we want? What don't we want in that second act? Well, there's quite a few things I don't want. I don't want a passive protagonist. Unfortunately, I get it quite often. When reading screenplays, very often we see stuff happening, events, all sorts of things happen to this character, but they don't do anything in response. They don't take action. They don't make choices. They don't make decisions. And then you have that dreaded passive protagonist. Later I'll go through all the ways you can avoid these problems, but let's now go through the list of potential stumbling blocks. All play and no work is another one. We're all familiar with the fun and games section in Act 2, where the character has energy and it seems like what they're doing is having an effect. But some screenplays have just that. All through Act 2, it's all fun. It's all play and no work. Characters need to suffer. They need to fight. Things need to be difficult. So we do not want all play and no work. I want to see stories that mean something. And too often, stories are empty. And I would call it thematic paucity. There's no voice. The writer has nothing to say or hasn't figured out what they've got to say, because everybody's got something to say. Sometimes we have wonderful high concept movies that we watch in one go and we're thrilled, and then at the end of the film it turns out to be completely forgettable. Thematic paucity. The film is about nothing. Sometimes the hero gets distracted. This is different from the passive protagonist. In the distracted hero case, the hero may not be passive. They may be doing all sorts of things, but not what they should be doing. I've read many scripts where a very clear goal was set up. We understood brilliantly, beautifully clear what the goal was and what the hero was supposed to do, and then they go off and do something else in Act 2. That's the distracted hero. Now, it's really important that what we see our character do in Act 2 has bearing on the outcome in Act 3. That there need to be efforts and attempts to achieving the goal that ultimately, possibly with a detour, but ultimately lead to the outcome of the film, which can be positive or negative. Often we see subplots that are too loosely linked to the journey of the main character, and that just doesn't work. So we need to stay focused. Our character too needs to stay focused. If they've set out goal A, they need to fight to achieve goal A and not go off and do something else. Who's heard of the Plausibles? It's a term coined by Alfred Hitchcock. What he meant by that was that group of people who always complain that the story is not realistic. Movies don't have to be realistic all the time. There are plenty of amazing classics that we're still rewatching, and where the stuff that happens on the screen doesn't really make sense. But it's well written, and we go along for reasons other than logic. The opposite is often true too, where things are just too implausible. When I watched Gravity, the Alfonso Cuarón science fiction, it took me about 30 minutes to be completely out of the story. Because I think it was about 25, 30 minutes in when George Clooney is tethered to this spaceship, and at some point he releases it and he drifts off. I go like, that just doesn't make any sense. When you make a science fiction movie, you are supposed to take the science into account. It needs to be plausible. It needs to be plausible up to a degree. Now, there are ways to suspend disbelief and do things that are impossible, but you need to set them up. And we'll look at that in a minute, how you can use techniques to play with that suspension of disbelief and push the plausibility into magic. This is pretty bad. When your pacing is glacial, you'll lose your audience and they'll go through an agonizing plight of wanting this thing to be over. So you need to make sure that there is a solid pace, that things keep happening. Now, that is not something for the editor. It has only minimally to do with how a film is edited. It has far more to do with the number of events and actions per minute, the amount of story material that you as the writer serve up in your screenplay. Pacing comes down to a number of things, and some of the other things in this list will ultimately contribute to pacing, but the most important thing is that the story moves forward. Personally, I like things to move, whether it's television or feature film, and right now I'm watching this Showtime television series called Your Honor with Bryan Cranston. To my taste, it just moves a little bit too slowly. I had the same issue with kind of like a similar show on Apple, which is called Defending Jacob. I like my stories to move fast. And that's why I like stories like Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul. Although Better Call Saul is a little bit slower, I guess. But glacial pacing is something you need to avoid at all cost, and I'll give you a few tips in a minute on how to do that. Here's one that you had probably expected to be in my list. That's the lack of point of view. Point of view, you need to understand, we're talking about dramatic point of view, not camera point of view. It's not about where the camera is and what we see on the screen. It's about who experiences the scene, through whose eyes we experience the story. In feature film, very often it's one and the same character who is at the center of the story, and we experience everything through their eyes and through their emotions. In television, you have somewhat more freedom. There's a lot more shifting point of view from one character to the next. Yet, you still need to manage that very carefully, because point of view is our way of identifying with characters. And even if you shift often, you need to know which characters your audience will go into. If you have a scene and our heroes in the scene, it's easy. We're going to take the hero's point of view most of the time. If our hero is not in the scene, there needs to be a character who's someone related to that hero. So when you have subplots, as we said earlier, they need to be feeding into the main plot, otherwise they'll be cut out. But equally, what happens on the screen needs to have an emotional impact on the hero. And then we'll take the point of view of the character who's most closely related to them. So always be aware of who has the point of view and check your entire story before you lock it off. Do you know where the point of view is? And do you go back to a limited set of characters? Because you can't just shift to anyone. So a good cohesive system of point of view is really important. This one I invented myself, character creep. Now, it's got nothing to do with creepy characters, but it's a term that is related to feature creep. If you have apps or computer programs, people tend to pile up features to it, and this similar things now happening to Zoom, in fact, which is very interesting because at some point I just lose my way. I don't know where to go to do the simplest things. It's called feature creep. We have a similar thing in screenwriting. It's called character creep. We need something to happen in our story. We introduce a new character to do that, and another character, and another character. So ultimately, you may end up with a whole army of cast, and it becomes unwieldy and difficult for the audience to follow and identify who you're talking about. It's somewhat easier on the screen. It's really difficult on the page. I experienced that myself when we were developing Danger Close, the Battle of Long Tan, where there are a large number of important characters in the real events. So we had to reduce that number and we had to collapse characters. Now there's another issue with characters in the second act, and it is the time when you introduce them. Ideally, characters should be introduced early. I'd say in the first half of Act 2. If you're going to introduce new characters towards the end of the story, it may feel awfully convenient to the writer to bring in that character who then needs to, fulfill their role over the next 5 or 10 minutes. Whereas if you introduce your character early enough, they become an organic part of the story, and that's far more effective. So be aware of character creep. I added Deus Ex Machina to the list, although it's typically an issue of the third act, but sometimes you have that already happening in the second act, where things happen outside the control of the main character, or rather forces and characters outside the main character solve the problems for our hero. That's something you need to avoid. You need to make sure that your character stays in control, that they're responsible for the most important decisions and the most important actions. The term Deus Ex Machina comes from Greek theater, where the god descended onto the stage using a machine. So the actor came down in a machine to play God. So here's a list, the overview, because all these things, if you look at them, they are pretty much common sense. But I do believe that it is handy to keep them close, and maybe consider this a checklist of things to avoid in your screenplay. So take the Taylor Sheridan approach, decide what don't you want, and then make sure you don't do that in your script. Some of you were there when I did the masterclass on fractal structure, in which I demonstrated how the same structural principles occur in a story on various levels. The same structures occur as mini structures on the scene level, and they occur as macro structures on the story level. Whether you're talking about a 5-year TV show or a 5-minute scene running. Each time you have a character with a goal, you have events and actions. And in the course of that masterclass, I showed the timeline somewhat differently. And I must admit that when I showed you that daunting blank timeline earlier, I omitted a few things. I omitted some vertical lines that break up that big timeline for your story. And here the letters stand for sequences. So we have 3 acts, but essentially those 3 acts are made up of, on average, 8 sequences. And if your film is about, say, 100, 120 minutes, then each of those sequences will be around, 10, 12 to 15 minutes maximum. And halfway, my beloved NPR, the midpoint reversal. If you missed that masterclass, maybe you need to sign up for our next round, because I will deliver that again. Or just go to the YouTube channel and watch the playlist, because I've got a whole playlist of videos especially about the midpoint reversal. By the way, check out the YouTube channel. It's the story department on YouTube. And make sure you subscribe so you are notified when we have new material arriving there. These masterclasses also appear on YouTube, most of them unlisted, especially for you, exclusive, because you pay for it. Some of them I use as promotional tools, and they'll be visible to anyone. And if you sign up to the channel, you'll be notified when they appear. And sometimes they're a little bit more, they have a bit more bells and whistles to them. So this is the more advanced structure of the feature film. Now, as I said, it's fractal. Ultimately, you'll find this in TV shows as well. They may not have 8 sequences. They may have 4 acts instead. And this color indicates, again, on average, the interplay of actions and events. The red vertical lines indicate the cliffhangers at the end of the sequences, and often they're events. The character is fighting to achieve something, and then something happens that goes right against it. And in television, that's where often you have your ad break. Now, we're only interested in this section, and look at that. That is far less daunting than what we saw earlier, that blank white line. Now we have 4 sequences where we're going to have characters trying to achieve many goals, and at the end of each sequence we're going to build for a climax or an event that intersects with those actions. And in this way we build an ebb and flow of events and actions, and we make sure that we always have rising tension. Halfway is the midpoint reversal. Yesterday some of the students tempted me into explaining what the function of the midpoint reversal is. If you have time at the end of this class, I may well go into it. Just ask me and I will go there. Now, the solutions. White. First of all, you've already seen sequences are your friend. What do sequences do? They break up that big chunk of story into smaller, more manageable sections. If you're interested in reading about sequences, I highly recommend Paul Gulino's book, The Sequence Approach. That is Screenwriting, The Sequence Approach. Paul Gulino, Gulino. Or Chris Soff. I forgot what the title of his book is, but I prefer Gulino's approach because it goes back to the dramatic tension as coined by Frank Daniel, who was a very smart thinker about screen story. I've spoken about events and actions. Now, just to recap, an event is something that happens to the character. Something that happens to the character. That's what we call an event. What the character does is an action. What they do always must be in response to an event. That's how you build a cohesive story. If a character does something seemingly random, out of nothing, it won't work. If they come up with an idea out of nothing, just because they thought of it, you need to somehow communicate it. And that's why screenwriters often create external triggers that make it clear for the audience how the character got that idea. So actions always come from events. It keeps it cohesive, but also keeps this happy ebb and flow of your story. It helps you to avoid passive protagonists because in a well-balanced story, you have sufficient actions responding to events. It also helps diagnosing the unmotivated protagonist. Unmotivated protagonist is the character who just does things and we don't know why they do things. We need events to trigger those actions. Next, the midpoint reversal. I mentioned that. Again, Paul Gulino wrote about that. So if you're still itching after watching the YouTube videos, check out Paul Gulino about the midpoint reversal. Although there's one difference, one thing I would like to clarify now, because I haven't never said this before, and it is it's kind of adding to Gulino's approach. Gulino says at the midpoint you have a high point. So it seems like the character has achieved their goal or could achieve their goal, or it's a false victory, and then you have the lowest point at the end of Act 2. That's the mirror opposite, and that's the reversal. You have the positive and negative. I look at it differently. I consider the midpoint reversal as a high immediately followed by a low, and it is that low that is the reversal. So we build up the second act to that midpoint high, and then the reversal drops immediately. Together, I consider them the midpoint reversal. So the plus minus at the midpoint, it's the kiss and the slap in Groundhog Day. For instance, it is Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid jumping off the cliff, and very many examples where we go into the darker territory of the story in what we call Act 2B. Give your characters hell. Don't give them just fun and games. They need to suffer, they need to struggle. A whole act with just breezing action, it doesn't work. So you need to make it really difficult for your characters. And here's an important one. You're writing stories that resonate, that have thematic resonance. You're writing stories about characters, about universal traits that we all recognize in the character on the screen. So ideally there should be some sort of transformation. We want to show our viewers how people can change. It's about finding out who we are, for the character, finding out who they are and how they deal with it. So that transformation needs to be visible on the screen. You need to map that out over the course of that second act. Ideally we need to see small incremental changes in the behavior of the character. There are certain points where the behavior changes more rapidly, more drastically. Midpoint reversal is one of them. The end point, the lowest point rather, the end of Act 2 is another one. So you're going to layer that arc over the actions of your character. So their decisions, their decision-making process, it's all slowly going to be impacted by their changing worldview. All right, this is about a transformational story. Admittedly, it is possible to tell a story without a character changing, but those are not typically the most successful stories. So always aim for that thematically deep, rich story where characters show some change. Change doesn't always have to be positive. I mentioned Breaking Bad. That's not a positive change. You look at One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, there's some change, but then the character relapses. So there can be a whole range of different sorts of arcs, but you need to know what arc you are using, and that needs to be consistent with the actions and decisions of your character. And this is helped by subplots. If you remember when we had our class at the end of 2020, the class about great endings, I showed you that final scene of Touch of Evil, where it seemed like there was a Deus Ex Machina. There was a character that was not the main character, that was not the antagonist, not the protagonist, came in and shot Orson Welles' character of Quinlan. Now that action sealed the journey, the heroic journey, transformational journey of the lieutenant, of Quinlan's right-hand guy, played by Joseph Kalea. The act of shooting his idol showed his transformation. It showed that he had now learned about the character and about the world. So that there's a subplot that was carefully prepared and that was mapped over the course of that second act, and that then results in the final action in the third act. And it doesn't always have to be who you believe or who the audience believes is the protagonist. Another example is in The Hangover. It's not Bradley Cooper who is the transformational hero. It is the dentist, Stu. So that arc also is layered throughout that comedy to end in that climactic action of the film. Instead of having a distracted hero who in the second act goes off and does things other than what they should do, you want razor focus. And that razor focus can be helped by the scene goals. Each scene goal needs to somehow contribute to the overall goal of the story. So we need to feel the story converge, go to one point, not diverge, and the character being starting to be interested in a whole lots of things that don't immediately relate to the goal, to the story goal. So keep that razor focus, and we're going to remember that because this is going to help us at the end of today's class when we have our Holy Grail. You know, I like looking for the Holy Grail in screenwriting. I've got another one for you in this class. Razor focus will help us to get there. And then we go to what I would call emotional logic. This is the answer to the problem of the plausibles. We're not after rational logic, although sometimes we need it. If you have a science fiction, you want there to be sufficient rational scientific logic. Things need to make sense. But some classic films, some classic scenes don't make any sense logically. Think about Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest. What is the best known scene in that movie? It's the crop duster scene. Now I challenge you to watch that movie again and ask yourself, why is that scene there? Why is the character there at that particular point in time? It doesn't make sense. But the scene is so tense, there's so much suspense that our disbelief is suspended. We believe what's on the screen despite the fact that there's no rational logic. There's an emotional logic. Another aspect of emotional logic is just purely the emotional response of each character to each event in the story. And a parallel I love to draw is the 5 Stages of Grief by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. you can transpose those easily to screenwriting and drama in general. When in a scene, a character is confronted with something they don't like, they will never immediately respond with the answer or with their ultimate reply. They still need to process this. And if you write, keeping that psychological reality in mind, that emotional logic, then your story will feel far more plausible in a way. So this is emotional logic. This is not rational, because characters and people in the real world often do things that don't seem rational, that don't make any sense, but it comes from that emotional logic. So when someone asks you in their notes, and we speak about notes in next week's masterclass, to be more realistic, ask yourself, why do they have that problem? Why did the story come across as not sufficiently realistic? Because if it's not a science fiction, if it's a comedy or a thriller, realism should not really be an issue. Maybe you haven't suspended disbelief. Maybe the scene is not tense enough. And here's a technique that I gave yesterday in answer to a question. A technique to suspend disbelief. When you have an element in your story that, if you isolate it, would be implausible, you can work with that. You can set it up so it becomes more plausible. I'll give you an example. Say you have your hero in a scene where they're under threat from an attacker, and we, the audience, know that there is a gun in a drawer in that room, but the character doesn't know. The character doesn't know where that drawer is or where the gun is. And then just when they need it, they miraculously go to the drawer, take the gun out and shoot the attacker. We won't believe that. That's pure nonsense. But it works if we've already seen the gun, and then we draw out that moment. We have the character slowly look for solutions. If they then ultimately open that drawer, you'll have your attention and there won't be any issue of implausibility. Now, the worst thing would obviously be if we didn't know the gun was there, you wouldn't even show anything. You need to set it up. We need to know it's there, so we kind of will the character to go to that drawer. And then when they do, it somehow feels more plausible, because in our mind, we've already put the two together. And that's how film works. So depending on what genre you work in, you need to find where the happy medium is in terms of realism and magic. The burden of plausibility depends on the type of story you're telling and the genre of the film. A really important one is the ticking clock. Ticking clock feeds into the pacing of your story. It's not just thrillers that have ticking clocks. Every story needs urgency. So the ticking clock stands for urgency. You need to tell your story within 2 hours or 100 minutes. It means that the audience needs to feel that there needs to be a solution within that time frame. So how do you do that? You can do it literally by having a timer, the counter counting down to the moment the bomb explodes. We know that's cliche, it still works depending on the genre of your film. But you can also just have a situation in which your character needs to achieve something by a certain date. For instance, the movie Winter's Bone, a small independent feature that launched the career of Jennifer Lawrence. She needs to find her father, and she only has a few days to do this. And then at the midpoint reversal, the ticking clock accelerates. The deadline is brought forward. You find it in big Hollywood movies just as much as in the small dramas. In Avatar, for instance, when Jake goes to Pandora, he needs to fulfill his mission within, I think, 30 days or 2 weeks. But at the midpoint reversal, it speeds up and he only has 24 hours left. And then in every great movie, towards the end, we approach real time. So we kind of live with the character second by second. So ticking clocks, they help you with that urgency. Give your characters a deadline and it will really help with the pacing. It's got nothing to do with how the film is edited. It's all up to you, the writer, to make this work. The solution to character creep is crowd control. Just make sure you keep your character count low. It also has to do with budget. For each character you add to the list, your film's budget is going up. If you're a beginning screenwriter, you don't want to have a screenplay that would bring a lot of risk, financial risk for the producer. So if you can keep your budget down by keeping your cast list down, that's a bonus. Collapse characters. See if you can collapse characters. See if you can give functions of one character to the next. You cannot collapse hero and antagonist. That's impossible. But there are other functions that you can collapse. And rising tension. Now this is, again, it seems like common sense, but it's one of those that should be on your checklist. Does your story keep building tension all the way through? If you were to do the tension graph, I think I mentioned that in our Fractal Structure class as well. If you were to connect your viewer to a lie detector and measure their bodily functions, you will notice that the tension will go up in the course of the film. But you can check that. Just look at each scene. Is there progression in the tension of what you give your audience? Some screenwriting software provides this function. The first time I saw it was in Power Structure. I'm talking 20 years ago. Power Structure, I don't think you can get it anymore. They're rebranding. I think it'll be available again soon as an online service. But in that software, you could give each scene a tension level, so in percentage. You had to decide as a writer, for you, where would this scene sit between 0 being nothing happening and 100%, which is the tension at which people start getting heart attacks. See The Hurt Locker? That's my best example. That's where I started getting concerned about my own well-being. So that's 100% tension. And then each scene you need to kind of plot somewhere on that graph between 0 and 100. And then at the end, you get the overview of your whole film in the shape of what looks like a stock market graph. Rising tension all the way through to the climax in Act 3. Setups, really important, because if your second act doesn't work, part of it may be in the setup, in the first act. And this too will be clear when we talk about the Holy Grail. You cannot have a character who is active and does fight for their goal with determination if that's not the character you set up in the first act. Setups we also use to tackle the implausibility, as you heard earlier. So set things up so you can use it later and give it emotional impact. As a result of a question when we ran the class for the first time, I've added this one, set pieces. I may have told you the story about this very gifted writer-director I used to work with. He's left the industry now because sadly the opportunities had gone away. As you know, it's tough. The way he would start writing a screenplay would be he would write about a dozen big scenes. That's the first thing he would do. He would think about a dozen amazing scenes that he would want to see. And once he had a dozen scenes, he knew he had a movie. So those were the set pieces. These are the scenes that would be remembered. If you think about your favorite movies, you probably remember favorite scenes in that movie. And you need to write those. You need to have them before you start writing your second act. Particularly comedy and horror, as Shauna said in our previous class. These are genres where these set pieces become very clear. So these are the anchor points. These are the tent poles for your film. And they need to be spaced out in some, almost equal distance, so you have that ebb and flow that we spoke about earlier. And sometimes you'll see that they coincide with the sequence climaxes. Set pieces. And then finally, thresholds. I'm a lover of thresholds. Thresholds have everything to do with movement. Keep your characters moving, but give them a reason to move. And going from A to B is not a reason. A good reason is when you get unstuck, when a problem is resolved. When the character is stuck emotionally and practically and physically, that's static. When the problem is resolved, that's when we move to the next stage in the story, but that's also when we can have the character move on the screen. Run, fly, drive, it doesn't matter. Create thresholds. that help the character go from one stage into the next. In order to understand thresholds, it's good to check out our masterclass on the hero's journey stages, because that's where they come in. And I'll give you the overview of it all. So you've got your checklist. One of the students yesterday did a screenshot at the end. But you get the link to all these recordings. You can always go back to it. And crowd control, rising tension, setups, set pieces, and finally, thresholds. For our holy grail on how to make your Act 2 work, we're going back to hell. And the title of that movie by the writer Taylor Sheridan, Hell or High Water. You want your character to go for their goal, come hell or high water. You want them to be completely committed, almost obsessive. They are unstoppable and razor focused. That's the type of character you want. If that's not the character you have, it will be an uphill battle. Maybe when you're a more experienced writer, you'll pull it off. You know how to create scenes that still make it work. But if you build a character that has this energy and drive, it will be much easier to deliver a second act that has the same momentum, pacing, energy, and drive. So make sure your character goes for their goal, come hell or high water. To put it in one description, one sentence, or just one phrase description of the ideal character you need to make this happen, it's a committed, near obsessive, razor focused, unstoppable protagonist. And there you have it. So we're a little bit earlier than usual. It means that there is time for questions, and I may be able to talk a bit about midpoint reversal. So while you guys post your questions in the chat, I could talk quickly about some of the questions yesterday. One of the students asked, how many characters can you have in a story before it becomes too crowded? That depends on the genre, and it also depends on how different those characters are and what the character's function is. Now think about it. When you pitch your story or you send out a screenplay and in the first 10 pages there's 25 characters set up, it's going to be impossible to visualize all those characters and remember them when they come back the second time. So it's too much. Happy average, maybe between 5 and a dozen. That works. I mean, some great stories revolve around no more than 5 characters. In television, you have that often, in comedy. But it depends ultimately on the needs of your story. If it is a true story, sometimes you're not just compelled, you're forced to include more characters than you would normally. But it depends on the genre, it depends on the medium. In television, you have a lot more time. Over the course of a season or multiple seasons, you can add characters to the mix, and it makes it exciting and makes it richer. If you look at shows like The Expanse, which is still on, sci-fi show that has a very big world with characters in different places that keep coming back depending on where our protagonist goes. Similar to The Wire, the David Simon crime drama of almost 20 years ago, next year. There you have a stratified world. You have groups of characters. You had the courthouse, and you had the streets, and then you had the cops. So if you present and pitch your characters as part of these groups, it's much easier to assimilate those and to remember them. So that's a way of dealing with characters and determining how many characters work.
In TV shows, do you have to have midpoint reversals in every scene?
There's nothing you must have. I do believe that these are all tools that ultimately will help you. In the greatest TV shows, I will find great midpoints reversal. I just mentioned The Wire, show that started in 2002, the David Simon show that by many is considered as the best television ever made, and it is in my top 3 list of all time. When that show started, it seemed so original and rich and innovating, and I didn't find much of these principles or patterns or rules, if you wish. And then I kind of, I was so immersed in the story that I wasn't really analyzing it. But then something happened halfway the first season that completely blew me away. And suddenly I had this epiphany, and it proved that there was, in this David Simon show, there was a midpoint reversal of quite huge significance. So the story is about a group of detectives who are trying to solve a case by using a wiretap. So the first act is trying to get the wiretap up, getting the right permissions, and knowing who to listen on. And then they try to solve the case. In that first season, their target is Avon Barksdale. He's a drug lord, and the problem is no one has ever seen him. They don't even know what he looks like. They don't even have a photo of him. And halfway that season, there's a scene in which one of the detectives has found an old photograph from a boxing match. It was an announcement of a boxing match, and it has Avon Barksdale with a pixelated photo. So they have a photo of him. And then they know there's going to be a sports event, and they expect him to be there in the crowd. So they go in and they try to identify him based on that photo. And they find him for the first time halfway the season. Now our heroes know who the antagonist is. They know his face. And then they follow him as he leaves, and they triangulate the position of his car, and through the radio they follow exactly where he is. And then there's this moment when chills went down my spine when they lose him. And nobody understands, because they were tracking him meter by meter, and suddenly it was like he vanished. He disappeared in thin air. And everybody's on the radio, it's like, what just happened? And one of the cars, the black SUVs of the cops, is driving somewhat aimlessly in the street, and we see our hero look out of the window, and from the opposite direction towards them comes this other SUV with the window half down, and it's the face of Avon Barksdale going to the cops like this. Now he knows they're after him. And that was just a phenomenal midpoint reversal. Wonderful. And in many films, many crime films, you'll see the midpoint reversal is the moment when the hero and antagonist are confronted for the first time. They see each other face to face, or they meet for the first time. There's the classic Michael Mann scene in Heat with Al Pacino and Robert De Niro. So those are all midpoint reversals. And there, David Simon in The Wire had it too. So that's my long-winded answer to your question, that yes, in television, you can have midpoint reversals add to the emotional experience. Good question. More of those. I should advertise here that I'm starting a group for people who struggle to find the time to write. It's called Merely Write. It's inspired by Seth Godin's phrase, merely do the work. It's about not fretting about all the constraints around it, or what you should or shouldn't do. It's about doing the work, sitting down, bum on seat and do the work. So Merely Write. If you want to join the group, just go to merelywrite.com, and you can fill out a poll to see which times work for you, and then we determine what the time slots in the week will be. It'll be sessions of an hour or 2 hours at the very most. So if that sounds like you, check it out, merelywrite.com. and just fill out the poll, and you're more than welcome to join. And don't forget to sign up for the YouTube channel. All right, that brings us to the end. Did that help you? Was it useful?
Right.
Good. All right, I'm pleased. And I'll send you the recording, a link to the recording. No scripts this week, but I promise you they'll be back as of next week when we speak about adaptation. Sorry, no, that's in 2 weeks' time. Next week we talk about taking notes, how to interpret notes you get from a producer or an agent or a script assessor. Hope you'll be there then. In the meantime, enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you later. Take care. Bye.